Hey there, viewers. Have you ever stepped into a place and immediately felt like you weren't supposed to be there? Drop your experience in the comments. Today's story takes us back to 2006, inside Diddy's secret club, where one person witnessed something so disturbing, it still haunts them to this day. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. A night that wasn't supposed to happen. The therapist's office smelled like lavender and old paper. I never understood why therapy offices always smelled the same, like someone was trying too hard to make it feel safe. It didn't work. Nothing ever did. I sat there, my hands in my lap, my fingers twisted together so tightly they ached. I hated this part, the silence before I had to speak. I didn't want to talk about it. I never did. But then, a few days ago, I saw his name again. Diddy, Sean Combs, whatever he called himself now. It was all over the news. More lawsuits, more women, more stories that sounded just like mine. I felt like I couldn't breathe when I read it, like I was choking on something invisible, something that had been lodged in my throat for years. I thought I had locked that night away. I thought if I never said the words out loud, it would stay buried, rotting in the back of my mind where it belonged. But the second I saw his face on the screen, it was like the walls collapsed, the memories poured in, thick and suffocating. I could still hear the music, still feel the heat of too many bodies pressed together, still taste the drink on my tongue, the one that made everything blurry. I swallowed hard and looked at my therapist, her eyes soft, expectant. She wasn't pushing me, but she didn't have to. The dam had already broken. I think I need to talk about it, I whispered, that night, the night at the club. Her expression didn't change, but I could tell she had been waiting for this moment. Take your time, she said. I closed my eyes, took a breath and let myself fall back into 2006. I hadn't even planned on going out that night. My sister and I had taken a trip to New York with a couple of her friends. It wasn't anything special, just a weekend away, a chance to see the city, shop, maybe go to a decent bar if we felt like it, but nothing wild. I wasn't that kind of girl. I never had been. We had already spent the day walking through Times Square, dodging tourists and street performers, and by the time we got back to our hotel, I was exhausted. I had my shoes off, my makeup wiped clean, and I was halfway into my pajamas when my sister's friend Lacey burst into the room, her phone clutched in her manicured hand, eyes bright with something I didn't like. "You guys," she said breathlessly, "I just got us into the 40/40 club." I frowned. "What's that?" Lacey gaped at me like I had just admitted I'd never heard of pizza. "Are you serious? It's Jay-Z's club. Celebrities go there all the time. It's impossible to get into." I glanced at my sister, hoping she'd shut this down, but she looked interested. "How'd you get us in?" Lacey grinned. "I know a guy. He works the VIP section. He said he'd put us on the list." Something in my gut twisted. "I don't know, Lace. We were just gonna chill tonight." She rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, come on. When will we ever get this chance again?" I wanted to say never, and that was fine with me. But my sister was already pulling out a dress from her suitcase, and I knew I'd be the only one left behind if I didn't go. And I hated being the odd one out. So I got dressed. The 40/40 club was everything I expected it to be. Loud, crowded, dripping in luxury. The second we stepped inside, it was like entering another world. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and top-shelf liquor. The bass from the speakers vibrated in my bones, and the lighting was dim enough to make everything feel surreal, like a dream I wasn't fully awake in. But the energy was different. I could feel it the moment we crossed the threshold. The bouncers at the door barely glanced at our IDs, but they looked at us, scanned us, like they were checking for something else, something unspoken. Inside, women in designer dresses leaned against the bar, their movements too controlled, too perfect. They weren't drunk, They weren't even really talking, just standing there, watching. The bartenders poured drinks without being asked. It was like they already knew what people wanted before they spoke. I should have listened to my gut. I should have turned around right then and walked out. But I didn't. A man appeared at my side, smiling like he knew me. I didn't know him. He was tall, well-dressed, dripping in gold chains and confidence. "You ladies enjoying yourselves?" he asked smoothly. Lacey jumped in before I could respond. "Yeah, this place is amazing." The man smiled wider, his teeth too white under the dim lights. "You should come to VI." I shook my head instinctively, but Lacey was already nodding. "Oh my God, yes," she turned to me. "Come on, when will we ever get this chance again?" That was the second time she said that. I should have said no. I didn't. The VIP section was different. The music was lower, the lighting even dimmer, like it was designed to make things blurry. The people here weren't just rich, they were untouchable. And then I saw him. Diddy. He was standing in the center of it all, surrounded by men who looked like security and women who looked like they weren't allowed to leave. He was talking, laughing, ordering rounds of drinks, and when his eyes passed over me, I felt something shift in the air. I reached for the drink in my hand. When did I even get a drink? And took a sip, trying to ground myself. It tasted off. The room tilted slightly, just a little. I blinked hard, trying to shake the feeling, but my body felt heavier. My thoughts weren't snapping together like they should. I put the drink down. A hand landed on my arm. I turned, expecting to see my sister, but it wasn't her. It was one of Diddy's men. He was smiling, but it wasn't friendly. "Come with me," he said. And just like that, the walls started closing in. Chapter 2. The VIP Trap. The air inside the VIP section felt different, thicker, warmer, like the walls held in more than just sound. The music outside the glass partitions was still pounding, but in here, it was muffled, just enough to feel disorienting, like stepping into another world where time worked differently. The lighting was low, casting a golden haze over everything, soft enough to blur the edges of reality. At first glance, it was perfect, the kind of perfection that didn't feel real. A waitress in a tight black dress swept past with a tray of drinks, placing flutes of champagne and crystal tumblers filled with amber liquid onto the tables. No one had ordered anything, but it didn't matter. The drinks kept coming, a never-ending supply, as if the people in this room didn't need to make choices, just follow the script laid out for them. I shifted in my seat, trying to push away the creeping discomfort crawling up my spine. Something about the way these women moved, the way they lingered in perfect formation around the room, felt unnatural. They weren't laughing loudly, spilling drinks, or talking over the music like women did at normal clubs. They were watching, poised, waiting, like dolls arranged on a shelf. Then the energy shifted. A ripple moved through the room, not loud, not obvious, but a silent wave of awareness that passed from one person to the next. Security straightened, conversations stalled. Every head turned at the same time, like a script had flipped a page, and the cast knew their cue. Diddy had arrived. I didn't see him at first. I felt him. The weight of his presence hit before I ever laid eyes on him. The way an approaching storm makes the air heavy in your lungs. And when he finally came into view, it was like everything in the room moved to accommodate him. He wasn't alone. His entourage flanked him like an army, men in dark suits, broad shoulders, cold eyes scanning the room without a flicker of emotion. And the women? They rearranged themselves, shifting subtly into place as if they already knew where they were supposed to be. I sat frozen, hands wrapped around the stem of a champagne flute I didn't remember picking up. Diddy moved through the space like he owned the air in it. Every glance, every small gesture sent a message. He was the gravity here, and everyone else orbited around him. His eyes swept the room, assessing. Then they landed on me. For a second, I thought I imagined it. That kind of man with that kind of power didn't notice girls like me. But I saw the shift. The moment his focus narrowed, the way his expression flickered with something calculating. He said nothing at first, just turned toward his men and gave the smallest nod. Minutes later, drinks appeared on our table. Not just one, not just two, several. Champagne, tequila, vodka, all mixed. I blinked at them, stomach twisting. A tall man, one of his guys, leaned in and grinned. "You're drinking tonight, right?" It wasn't a question. My sister hesitated, her fingers tightening on her glass, but Lacey was already downing a shot, giggling like she had just been handed a golden ticket. The man watched me, expectant. His smile never reached his eyes. I forced a nod. One sip. Just one. I told myself that as I lifted the flute to my lips, tasting the champagne's sharp, dry bubbles. But the moment it hit my tongue, I knew something was off. There was a bitterness beneath the sweetness, something that didn't belong. I put the glass down. The room started to shift. Not suddenly, not all at once, but subtly, cruelly, like stepping into deep water and realizing too late that the ground was no longer beneath your feet. The music became a low hum in the back of my skull. My limbs were heavy, my thoughts slowed, losing their shape. I turned to my sister, tried to focus on her face, but even she looked different. Her features stretched and softened, like I was looking at her through water. She was saying something, her lips were moving, brow furrowed in concern, but I couldn't hear her. The world narrowed, darkened at the edges, like the walls were closing in. A hand touched my shoulder, firm, possessive. I turned, and there he was. Diddy, standing too close, smiling like he already knew the answer to a question I hadn't heard. He leaned in, breath warm against my skin. "You good?" I wasn't, but I couldn't say it. The words wouldn't form. His fingers brushed the back of my neck, feather-light, too familiar, too certain. "You're mine tonight," he murmured. The room tilted. I tried to pull away, but my body wasn't mine anymore. My limbs didn't respond the way they should. The world around me warped, melted into something wrong. The last thing I saw before the darkness took over was my sister's face, and the fear in her eyes. Chapter 3, The First Red Flag. No one saw. The world around me felt slow, distorted, like I was moving through thick air that resisted every step I took. I wasn't drunk. I'd been drunk before, and this wasn't that. This was different. My limbs were heavy, but my mind was light, floating somewhere outside of my body. The room pulsed, not with the bass of the music, but with something deeper, something primal that my instincts recognized before my brain did. I had to get to the bathroom. I forced my feet forward, one shaky step at a time, weaving through the crowd of people who seemed completely unaware that something was wrong. They were laughing, drinking, pressing their bodies close to one another, but I could barely hear them. Their voices were muffled, their faces blurred at the edges. Somewhere behind me I heard my sister's voice. At least, I thought I did, but when I turned my head, all I saw were strangers. The hallway to the bathroom was dimly lit, the kind of place you'd expect a line to form. But there was no one, just a narrow passage leading to a door with a gold plaque that read, "Ladies." I pushed inside and gripped the edge of the sink, forcing myself to breathe. Cold water. I needed cold water. I turned the faucet on, letting it run over my fingers before splashing it against my face. The shock of it sent a shiver down my spine, but it wasn't enough to clear the fog in my head. I lifted my gaze to the mirror, trying to focus on my own reflection. My pupils looked blown, my skin paler than it should have been. I knew my body, and I knew something was inside me that shouldn't be. I wasn't alone. At first, I thought I was seeing double, my vision still blurred at the edges, but then she moved, and I realized she was real. A girl stood next to me, gripping the sink so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Her dress was designer, tight-fitting, made to hug curves in all the right places, but the strap on one side was torn, dangling against her shoulder like someone had pulled too hard. Her eyes were lined with black, but the mascara had smudged, smeared across her cheek. It wasn't the messy kind of smudge that happened after hours of dancing. It looked like she had been crying. She didn't look drunk. She didn't look high. She looked vacant. I swallowed, my throat dry and raw, and forced my mouth to form the words sitting on my tongue. "Are you okay?" The girl's head turned slowly, almost like she was moving underwater. Our eyes met in the mirror, and for a second she didn't speak. She just stared at me, something like recognition flickering behind her gaze. Then finally she shook her head. Not a big shake, not dramatic, just a small, tired movement. "Don't let them take you upstairs," she whispered. A chill crawled up my spine, digging its nails into my skin. "Upstairs?" My own voice sounded foreign, like I wasn't the one speaking. The girl didn't answer. She just dropped her gaze to the sink, her breathing shallow. My heart was pounding now, the beat hammering against my ribs. I wanted to ask her more. Who, why, what happens upstairs? But before I could, the door creaked open. I turned, expecting to see another girl, maybe a group of them, laughing and fixing their makeup. But instead, it was them. Big men in suits, silent, watching, blocking the exit. The energy in the room shifted instantly. It was like the air had been sucked out, leaving only a heavy silence. One of them, taller than the others, with a shaved head and cold, empty eyes, stepped forward. His suit was perfect, not a wrinkle in sight, his shoes gleaming under the dim bathroom lights. "He's waiting for you." It wasn't a question. I took a step back, bumping into the sink, my fingers gripping the edge like a lifeline. "Who?" My voice was barely more than a whisper. The man just stared, unblinking. The girl next to me didn't move. Didn't even look up. It was like she had already given up. I turned back to the men, my pulse hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. "I need to find my sister," my words slurred together, the fog in my brain thickening. The bald man tilted his head slightly, like he was considering something. Then, in a voice so smooth it made my stomach turn, he said, "She's fine. You don't need to worry about her." A fresh wave of nausea rolled through me. How did they know who my sister was? I tried to think, tried to put together a way out of this, but my limbs weren't cooperating. My thoughts weren't snapping into place like they should. One of the men stepped forward, closing the space between us. His cologne was overpowering, suffocating. "Let's go," he murmured. I shook my head, my breath coming faster now. "No." A hand landed on my wrist. Not hard, not yanking, just firm, just enough to say, "You don't get to say no." I tried to pull away, but my body was betraying me, my strength buried under whatever was in my system. In the mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the girl beside me. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring at the sink, her fingers still locked around the porcelain. Like she had seen this happen before. Like she knew there was nothing I could do to stop it. The hand on my wrist tightened, and then they led me out of the bathroom. The club was still alive, pulsing, but it felt like a different world now. I was leaving the part everyone else could see. I was going somewhere no one talked about. Somewhere upstairs. Chapter 4. The bathroom door slams open. The moment the bathroom door crashed open, something inside me locked up. It wasn't just fear. It was a visceral, primal shutdown, like my body had decided to freeze rather than fight. My heart pounded against my ribs, hard enough to rattle my chest, but the rest of me wouldn't move. The air thickened, the walls of the small bathroom pressing in, shrinking the space around me until it felt like I could barely breathe. At first, I thought it was security. Maybe one of the men who had been watching me from the moment I stepped into VIP, the ones who hovered at the edges of the club like shadows, always in place but never fully seen. But it wasn't them. It was him. Diddy stepped into the doorway with the kind of unnatural confidence that men like him carried, men who never heard no in their lives, men who walked into rooms and expected them to rearrange around them. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The air shifted around him the way it did in the club, except now the room was too small, too contained. There was nowhere to go, no music to disappear into, no crowd to use as cover. He didn't acknowledge the girl standing by the sink, the one who had just whispered that warning to me. The warning I still didn't fully understand. It was like she wasn't even there. He didn't spare her a glance. His attention was entirely on me. I tried to step back, but my spine hit cold tile, pressing me against the bathroom counter. My hands gripped the edge, nails digging into the stone, grounding myself. But my knees were weak, unreliable. The lingering fog in my head, the heaviness in my limbs, the way my balance felt off. I wasn't just drunk. I wasn't just overwhelmed. Something was inside me that I didn't put there. He took another step forward. "You know who I am, right?" His voice was lower than I expected, rough but controlled, not loud. He didn't need to be loud. His presence alone was enough. I could smell the faint burn of liquor on his breath, something sharp, something bitter. The scent of expensive cologne, clean sweat, and something deeper, something that didn't belong in this space, something predatory. I nodded before I even realized I had done it. My body moved on instinct, and that instinct wasn't defiance. It was survival. The corner of his mouth twitched upward in a smirk, the kind that wasn't amused, wasn't friendly, the kind that said, "I own this moment. I own you." He leaned in, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin, the heat radiating from his body, the space between us disappearing like it had never existed. "I get what I want," he murmured. The words weren't a question. His fingers brushed my wrist, light at first, like he was testing something, then tighter, firm, controlling. He didn't squeeze hard, not enough to bruise, but enough to tell me I wasn't in charge here. I tried to pull back, but my body was betraying me. I felt slow, disconnected from myself, like I was watching this happen from somewhere else, somewhere outside my own head. My breath hitched, my pulse hammering, my mind screaming at me to do something, say something, push him away. But then he was pushing me down. I felt the pressure against my shoulders, not forceful, not violent, just inevitable. Like this was something he had done before, something he expected. Like I wasn't a person, just a moment waiting to happen. The air vanished from my lungs. The bathroom shrank around me. My knees buckled, hitting the cold tile. My hands braced against the counter's edge, fingers slipping against the stone. I didn't realize I had started shaking until I saw my own hands trembling. He was still speaking, low murmurs that tangled into my ears, but I couldn't focus on the words. The bass of the club's music thrummed through the walls, a reminder that I was still there, still inside the world, still close enough that people should have been able to hear me if I screamed, but I knew, deep down, that nobody would come. Nobody would stop this. Nobody ever did. A noise. Something outside the door. It wasn't loud, just a shuffle, a slight creak of movement, something that wouldn't have meant anything under different circumstances, but in that moment, it was everything. His grip loosened, not much, but enough. I didn't hesitate. My body reacted before my brain even caught up. I yanked back, twisting away, throwing my weight in the opposite direction. My shoulder knocked into him, hard enough to catch him off guard, but not enough to hurt him. It didn't matter. It was enough. I bolted. The bathroom door slammed against the wall as I pushed through, my vision tunneling, my balance still shaky. The hallway outside was still empty except for the bodyguard standing near the entrance, the same one who had walked me here, the one who had been waiting. He turned his head slightly, his unreadable gaze locking onto me. I froze. For a split second I thought it was over, that I had made it this far just to be dragged back in. But then, he stepped aside. He didn't help me, but he didn't stop me either. And that was all I needed. I ran. My legs were still weak, my body still not fully mine, but adrenaline burned through the fog, pushing me forward, keeping me upright. I barely registered the flashing lights, the people, the moving bodies. All I could see was the exit, the distant glow of the club's entrance, the glass doors that led outside, the promise of air, of freedom, of something that wasn't this. I stumbled, nearly tripping, but I couldn't. And then I turned, frantic, searching, my pulse hammering with a new kind of panic. Because I had made it out, but my sister was still inside. Chapter 5. The bodyguards and the back room. The exit was so close, just a few more steps. I could see the revolving doors spinning, people stepping in and out, moving between the world outside and the one I was desperately trying to leave behind. Every time the doors opened, I caught flashes of the street, yellow taxis, headlights streaking past, the neon glow of signs reflecting off rain-slick pavement. It was right there, a completely different reality, one where the air was cold and sharp and one where none of this was happening. My body wasn't fully my own, but I pushed forward anyway, forcing my legs to move despite the way they trembled beneath me. My heels scraped against the floor, my vision tilting slightly as the remaining effects of whatever had been in my drink clung to my limbs like weights. The club around me was alive, pulsing loud, people laughing, drinking, pressing close together in their own worlds, completely oblivious to the fact that someone was trying to escape right next to them. Then a hand clamped around my wrist. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't questioning. It was possession. I barely had time to process the touch before I was yanked backward, hard enough that I stumbled, my breath hitching as my body spun toward the force that had stopped me. A man, one of them. The security, the ones who had been watching me all night. He wasn't just big. He was built like a wall, solid and unmoving, a man whose entire existence revolved around control. His suit was crisp, not a wrinkle in sight, his expression unreadable. His grip on my wrist was firm, fingers digging into my skin just enough to remind me that I wasn't going anywhere. I yanked, twisted, tried to jerk away, but his hold only tightened. "Where you think you going?" His voice was low, smooth, almost casual, like this was a game. I shook my head, my breath coming faster, chest rising and falling in frantic, shallow movements. "I need to go," I managed, my words slurring slightly. My sister." Before I could finish, another hand grabbed my other arm, two of them now. I gasped, twisting, thrashing, my pulse roaring in my ears. They didn't flinch. They didn't struggle to contain me. They didn't have to. They had done this before. I opened my mouth, tried to scream, but the music was too loud, the bass swallowing the sound whole. The bodies around me moved like they were in a different universe, drinking and laughing, oblivious. Or maybe they weren't oblivious. Maybe they just didn't care. I fought harder, my heels slipping against the floor, arms jerking wildly in their grip. I didn't care how I looked, didn't care if I made a scene. I had to get out. Then the door opened. Not the exit. A different door. A back room. Not an office, not storage, not anywhere that normal club goers would ever see. The door was unmarked, blending into the walls, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The inside was dark, the shadows stretching long under the dim lighting. I didn't know what was in there, but I knew it wasn't somewhere I wanted to be. I thrashed harder. My knee came up, hitting something solid, but it wasn't enough. One of them growled under his breath, annoyed now. My head snapped back as a hand gripped the back of my neck, forcing me forward toward the darkened doorway. The floor shifted under my feet. I was losing. And then, a scream. Not mine. My sister's. It cut through everything, a sharp, high-pitched sound that cracked the air like a whip. My head jerked up, my body going still for just a second as I processed it. She was close, somewhere in the club, shouting my name. The men holding me stopped. It was small, barely a hesitation, but it was enough. I twisted, all my weight shifting to the side, ripping my arm free from one of them. My shoulder wrenched, pain exploding through the joint, but I barely felt it. The other man tried to tighten his grip, but I was already moving, my heel stomping down onto his foot as hard as I could manage. A sharp curse flew past his lips. I ripped away and ran. I didn't stop to see if they were following, didn't check to see if they were angry or if they'd let me go. I ran straight into the crowd. Bodies pressed against me from all sides, the heat suffocating, the smell of sweat and alcohol thick in the air. I shoved through them, twisting, ducking, moving as fast as my legs would allow. Then I saw her. My sister was standing on one of the velvet VIP couches, knocking over drinks, pushing people away from her, screaming at the top of her lungs. She had made them look. She had made sure every single person in VIP was watching her. One of the bouncers turned toward her, distracted just long enough, and then we were running. She grabbed my wrist, yanking me forward, both of us shoving through the crowd together. The men were close behind. I could feel them moving, their presence like a shadow bearing down on us. The exit was ahead, but it still wasn't close enough. A bouncer stepped in front of the door. For a second I thought it was over, but then his eyes flicked over my shoulder, toward the back room where I had almost disappeared. His lips pressed together like he was weighing something. Then he stepped aside. Not much. Just enough. We burst through the doors, and then we were outside. The cold air hit my skin like a slap, shocking me fully awake. The city was loud, bright, alive. Horns blaring, voices shouting, neon signs buzzing in the darkness. My knees buckled. My sister caught me, her arms holding me up as my breath came in ragged gasps. I turned, expecting them to follow, expecting someone to come after us. But the doors behind us never opened. Nobody chased us. Nobody needed to. They had already won. We had made it out. But not everyone did. Chapter 6. The Car Ride from Hell. The cold air stung my skin like tiny needles, sharp and unforgiving against the heat still clinging to my body. My breath was ragged, uneven, torn from my lungs in short bursts as I hunched forward, hands on my knees, trying to force oxygen back into my chest. My legs still felt weak, my balance uneven, as if the ground beneath me had tilted slightly. My body wasn't my own. I was still trapped in that suffocating haze, the one that made my limbs feel sluggish and my mind thick, like I was moving through something invisible but heavy. But I was out. We were out. The doors of the club had shut behind us, sealing the world we had just escaped from inside, separating it from the one in front of me, a world that kept moving as if nothing had happened. New York was still awake. The streets were still busy, headlights flashing past, the rumble of traffic blending with distant voices, the occasional honk cutting through the night. People walked past us on the sidewalk, laughing, talking, lost in their own worlds, completely unaware that my world had just caved in on itself. No one knew. No one cared. I felt my sister's hand grip my arm, her fingers digging in just enough to keep me standing. I turned toward her, my vision still slightly unfocused, the lights too bright, the sounds too sharp. She was breathing fast, her chest rising and falling, her face pale beneath her makeup. Her eyes darted around, scanning the street, searching for something, an escape, a way out, anything that would put distance between us and that place. A cab slowed as it passed, its headlights reflecting in her wide, panicked eyes. Without hesitating, she stepped forward, one hand shooting up, fingers shaking slightly as she waved it down. The car pulled to the curb, the tires screeching slightly against the pavement. My sister yanked the door open and pushed me inside, following right behind me, slamming it shut before we were even fully in. The moment the door closed, everything felt smaller. The smell of the leather seats, the faint scent of air freshener masking something stale underneath, the low hum of the engine vibrating beneath us, it all pressed in around me, closing the space, making it harder to breathe. The driver didn't say a word. He glanced at us through the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. My sister leaned forward, rattling off the address of our hotel, her voice steady in a way that didn't match the way her hands shook in her lap. The driver gave a small nod, shifted into gear, and pulled away from the curb. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, my breath fogging the surface slightly. The city outside blurred past in streaks of neon and headlights, storefronts flashing by, people moving in and out of bars, their faces animated, their laughter spilling out into the night. It was like looking at a world I didn't belong to anymore. I lifted my hands, staring at my fingers. They were trembling, uncontrollable, a physical reaction to something my mind still hadn't fully processed. Did that just happen? The words fell from my lips, barely more than a whisper, as if saying them out loud would make them real in a way I wasn't ready for. My sister didn't answer. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the seat in front of her, her jaw tight, her fingers gripping the hem of her dress so hard that the fabric had twisted. I swallowed, my throat dry, my stomach twisting painfully. "Lacey," I whispered, using her name like it was an anchor, something to pull her back. Did that just happen? Still, she didn't look at me. Instead, she closed her eyes, inhaled slowly through her nose, and said, "We don't talk about this." Her voice was firm, final. I stared at her, my chest tightening, my fingers digging into my thighs as the full weight of her words settled over me. "We don't talk about this. Ever." I turned back toward the window, my heartbeat thudding in my ears, the words repeating over and over in my head. "We don't talk about this. We don't talk about this." The streetlights outside flickered across my face in intervals, casting shifting shadows across my reflection. I barely recognized myself. My mascara had smudged slightly under my eyes, my lipstick faded, my hair slightly disheveled from how roughly I had been grabbed. But it wasn't just that. It was the look in my own eyes. The hollow, distant look of someone who had seen something they weren't supposed to see, who had been somewhere they weren't supposed to be. My sister was still facing forward, her hands now folded in her lap, her back rigid, her entire body still. She was disappearing into herself, shutting down, blocking it out, erasing the past hour from existence before it could fully take root. I knew what she was doing, because I was trying to do it too. But no matter how hard I tried to push it away, the images kept looping behind my eyes. The unmarked door, the girl in the bathroom with the torn dress, the bodyguards, the drinks that tasted wrong, the pressure of his hand on my wrist, the way the club kept moving, kept drinking, kept laughing, completely unaware that I had almost disappeared into a room I was never meant to leave. Or maybe they had known. Maybe they had just seen it happen too many times to care. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my fingertips against my temples, as if I could physically erase the memories before they fully settled. Outside, the city didn't stop for me, didn't stop for what had almost happened. New York didn't care. Nobody in that club had cared. And now, my own sister was telling me that we couldn't care either. The cab driver hadn't spoken a word since we got in. He wasn't looking at us anymore. His eyes stayed on the road, hands relaxed on the wheel, like he hadn't noticed the way we had stumbled into his car like two people escaping something neither of us could name. Or maybe he had noticed. Maybe he just knew better than to ask questions. When he finally pulled up to our hotel, my sister opened her purse, pulled out cash, and dropped it into the front seat without counting. But she didn't even wait for change. She shoved the door open, stepping out into the night, her heels clicking against the pavement. I followed, my legs still weak, the city's cold air cutting into my skin but failing to reach the heat still burning underneath. The cab pulled away before we even made it to the front doors. Gone just like that, as if it had never happened, as if none of it had ever happened. But it had, and I would never stop seeing it. Chapter 7: The Aftermath and the Silence. The next morning felt like another life. I woke up in a bed that wasn't mine, tangled in hotel sheets that smelled like detergent and fabric softener, the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. For a moment, just a moment, I wasn't anywhere. I wasn't in New York. I wasn't in that club. I wasn't pressed against a cold bathroom counter with hands gripping my wrists, pulling me somewhere I wasn't meant to go. I was just floating in the space between sleep and consciousness, my mind blank, my body weightless. Then I moved. A shift. A stretch. The kind you make before you even open your eyes. Recording production. Deep and dark. Depression. On the other side of the screen, me, smiling. The pain. A dull ache in my wrist. Not sharp, not unbearable, but there, lingering, a reminder. My eyes snapped open. The hotel ceiling was pale, off-white, the kind of sterile color that could belong to any room in any city. I turned my head, the sunlight filtering in through the gap in the curtains, casting a golden streak across the carpet. It was morning, a new day, a new world. And yet, everything wasn't new, because my wrist still hurt. I sat up slowly, the sheets pooling around my waist, and lifted my arm, turning it over. My breath caught in my throat. A bruise, faint but visible, darkening beneath the surface of my skin, the shape of fingers. I stared at it, my heart pounding, the events of the night before crashing into me like a wave. I could still feel the heat of the club, the weight of the music pressing against my skull. I could still hear the murmur of his voice. I get what I want. I could still feel the hands, the grip, the way my body had fought to move while my mind screamed at me that it was too late. I clenched my fists. It happened. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined it. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my bare feet pressing into the soft carpet, grounding me. My body was sore in a way that didn't make sense. My stomach felt hollow. My mouth was dry. I reached for the bottle of water on the nightstand, twisting the cap off with trembling fingers, and took a slow sip, forcing myself to swallow past the tightness in my throat. The room was too quiet. I turned my head and saw my sister lying in the other bed, curled up, her face turned away from me. Her breathing was deep, steady, but her body was tense. Even in sleep, she wasn't relaxed. I swallowed again, then reached for my phone. My hands were still shaking. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe I was looking for proof that the world was still the way it had always been. Maybe I was hoping, praying, that I would find something, anything, that acknowledged what had happened. I opened the browser and typed his name. Sean Combs, Diddy. The page loaded in seconds. There he was, smiling, standing on red carpets, dressed in expensive suits, holding awards. Pictures from events, headlines about business ventures, articles about upcoming projects, partnerships, endorsements. I scrolled faster, my breath catching in my chest. Nothing. No headlines about missing girls. No articles about what happened behind those velvet ropes. No whispers about the VIP rooms or the back doors that didn't lead to exits. I clicked on news. Still nothing. It was like the night before had been wiped from existence. I exhaled shakily, lowering the phone, staring down at the screen as my reflection glared back at me in the dim light. For a split second, I doubted myself. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe I had misread the situation. Maybe I was drunker than I realized. Maybe my memory had twisted things into something worse than they actually were. But then I looked at my wrist again. The bruise stared back at me. I wasn't imagining it. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my fingertips against my temples. The choice sat there, heavy in my chest. Speak out or stay silent like all the others. I thought about the girl in the bathroom, the way she had whispered her warning without looking at me, without asking for help. She had known. She had known because she had been there before, and she had known there was nothing she could do to stop it. I thought about the bodyguard outside the bathroom, the way he had moved just enough to let me pass, but not enough to actually help me. He had known, too, and yet the club had still been full. The music had still played, the drinks had still flowed, people had still laughed and danced and flirted because none of them knew. Or maybe they did, and they had decided not to care. I let out a slow, shuddering breath. No one was going to believe me, and even if they did, it wouldn't matter. Men like him didn't lose. They didn't answer for things like this, and I had gotten out. That should have been enough. I set the phone down. I curled my fingers into my palm, pressing against the bruise on my wrist, letting the pain remind me that I was still here. I didn't wake my sister. I didn't say another word. And when we checked out of the hotel a few hours later, walking through the lobby as if nothing had happened, neither of us looked back. Chapter 8. What still haunts me today. It's been years. Long enough that I should have forgotten. Long enough that I should have buried that night in the place where bad dreams go to die. That's what I told myself anyway, that it was just one night, just one close call, that I had made it out, that I should be grateful, that my life had continued while others weren't as lucky. I told myself a lot of things over the years. I told myself it didn't matter, that it wasn't worth dredging up, that nothing actually happened, that I should let it go. I told myself there was no point in saying anything when no one would believe me. I told myself I had misunderstood, that maybe it was all just a misunderstanding, that maybe, just maybe, I had imagined the whole thing. But the bruise on my wrist had been real. The way my voice didn't come out when I tried to scream had been real. The way his hands felt, the way the bathroom walls had seemed to close in, the way the club had swallowed me whole and almost never spat me back out, that had been real. And if I had spoken up back then, what would have happened? Nothing. The world wouldn't have listened. Men like him didn't lose. They were too powerful, too connected, too untouchable. They were protected by money, by lawyers, by silence. I had seen it with my own eyes, the way security had known, the way the girl in the bathroom had known, the way the entire VIP section had kept drinking and laughing while I was being dragged toward a door that didn't lead to an exit. They all knew, and none of them cared. So I moved on. At least, that's what I told myself, until the lawsuits started rolling in. I don't remember the first headline I saw, only the way my stomach clenched when I read his name. At first, I didn't want to click. I didn't want to know. I had spent years trying not to know, but my hands were moving before my brain could stop them, my phone screen glowing in the dim light of my bedroom as I scrolled. Zon Combs accused of sexual assault. It was just one article at first, then another, then another. And then it wasn't just one woman, it was many. Each story was different, but the details were the same. The drugs, the VIP rooms, the feeling of losing control of your own body, like something was slipping away and you didn't know how to get it back. The security that wasn't there to protect you, but to keep you in line. The walls closing in. The moment of realization. The knowledge that it was too late. I sat in my apartment, phone clutched in my hands, reading story after story, feeling like my chest was being crushed. Their stories sounded just like mine. Some of them hadn't gotten away. Some of them had disappeared into those back rooms and never made it back out. Some of them had kept the secret for decades, just like I had. And now people were finally listening. I watched the world react in real time, the lawsuits piling up, the stories spreading like wildfire, the slow, steady unraveling of a man who had spent his entire career untouchable. For the first time in my life, I saw his face on the news, not on a red carpet, not at an awards show, not in a business deal, but in handcuffs. I stared at the screen, at the same face that had smirked down at me in that bathroom all those years ago. And I felt nothing. Not relief, not joy, not revenge, just emptiness. Because it was too late. Too late for the ones who never got out. Too late for the girls who were dragged through those hidden doors and never saw the neon lights of the city again. Too late for all the people who had been warning us for years, only to be ignored, silenced, laughed at. And maybe too late for me. I had survived, I had walked away, I had left that night behind. But the truth was, I had never really left, because the past never truly stays buried. And no matter how many years pass, no matter how many headlines get written, no matter how many courtrooms he steps into, I will always be in that club. I will always be standing at the edge of that unmarked door, staring into the darkness, knowing what waits on the other side. And I will always wonder, how many of us never got out?